This morning, our society leader, Hugh Taft-Morales, will be reflecting on the distance we've come and the long distance remaining for gender equity in our society. Hugh.
Morning, everybody. So, when speaking about or supporting women-led struggles against misogyny and sexism, I strive to do this with humility. I don't mean to speak for women. I don't mean to mansplain. And I acknowledge that my voice carries with it centuries of male privilege. Now, there are times in my life where I've been ignorant or insensitive about issues surrounding gender, sexuality, harassment, power. In fact, in a recent conversation about this talk that I was writing with my family, I stumbled in that regard. So, this is something that, despite my intentions, I know that I do things to perpetuate patriarchy. And I'm trying harder to do better, and I'm still learning. But, given the context of widespread instances of domestic violence and rape and political infringement on the bodily autonomy of women, not talking about this seems like an abdication of ethical responsibility. So today, as I share wisdom that I've drawn from women, I'm trying to do so in a way that contributes to truth-telling and justice and healing. Before I go into my content, I want to add that these days we're navigating deep concerns about gender and the complexities of that. And while categories are useful, no label captures the essence of any individual or fully describes any group. So when I'm speaking about men and women today, I do so while appreciating the uniqueness of every person. And as we broaden the conversation, I think we need to include everyone, including those from queer and non-binary communities, and to keep in mind a diversity of perspectives within all of these groups. It'll help us imagine a better world. Now, imagination is a big part of my talk today, because both in the book and the film titled Women Talking, imagination is very important, as is the power of words. Now, what I'm going to do today is summarize briefly, after talking about words, I'm going to summarize what happened in this Mennonite community in South America that inspired both the book by Toews and the film directed by Polley. After that, I'm going to talk about the book and the film, drawing some lessons from those portrayals. Now, if you haven't seen the film or read the book, I urge you to do so, even though I'm going to throw some spoilers today, because I think that the conversation that book and that film is encouraging is one that we need to have in order to end misogyny and sexism more quickly. Now, our ethical culture community is no stranger to patriarchy, something that ethical culture leader Joan Johnson Lewis has taught me over the years. Our founder, Felix Adler, maintained some repressive Victorian attitudes towards women. For example, he believed that women serve society best when focusing on child rearing and education, typical of men of his generation. He opposed divorce, even though it was one of the only ways that women could escape oppressive situations at home. He opposed women's suffrage for a number of reasons, including, he said that women were just too sensitive. He said that they would develop the habit of going about in crowds, okay, and that it would add, quote, even more ignorant voters to the voting rolls. Adler even argued that because women had influence over their men, of the menfolk in their lives, that giving them the vote would give them more power than the men in their lives. How does that, anyway. Resistance to women is also systemic in ethical culture. The first woman platform speaker in ethical culture was from this Ethical Culture Society of Philadelphia podium back in 1886. On May 16th, Dr. Frances Emily White spoke here. But only one woman was certified as an ethical culture leader before the 1950s. That was Anna Garland Spencer. Women were not explicitly permitted to be members in the first 14 years of the Ethical Society in New York, which was the first and the mothership of the movement, sort of. The first woman elected to the board of the New York Society was not until 1901, 25 years after ethical culture was founded. And the first woman president of the New York Society was elected in 1994. So I keep those things in mind when speaking as an ethical culture leader. Since Adler's times, women have made great strides towards equity in our country, but we have a long way to go. And despite the sacrifice of countless of women activists, men still dominate powerful positions, and you know this. Women make up less than 30% of Congress. They make up only 10.4% of Fortune 500 CEO positions. They're well underrepresented in literature, in film, in social media. I spoke a while ago about literature, and something new I found out in one study. It showed that men and women tend to read in roughly equal proportion authors of men and women. That women read equal proportions of male and female authors. But in one study, it indicated that 80% of the books read by men were written by men. Now, I wondered whether that's due to hostile attitudes towards women, or is it just the result that men like to be in their own company, and maybe wonder, is that the same thing? But whatever the answers, the statistics indicate a great uphill struggle for women authors in this country. Most literary agents, editors, publishers, and book reviewers are men. Men outnumber women on conference panels and as recipients of literary awards. Of the 110 Nobel laureates in literature, women have received only 14. Men dominate lists of the greatest books. If you find these lists, you'll see that they're dominated by men. A couple of women authors have told me that many male gatekeepers in the literary world harbor anti-women attitudes and gendered assumptions. And things are no better in social media, in the podcast industry, which is really booming. Last March, Gina Chirilis wrote in the New York Times about how men dominate this booming market and how many women, in her experience, are told by women how they hear mocking attitudes on the point from these men in podcasts in subtle and not so subtle ways. She said that many women have told her that, quote, the men that they listen to are, quote, endlessly fascinated by their own opinions, loves the sound of their own voice, and aren't the least bit shy about offering unsolicited opinions on masculinity, sexuality, and women. Now, that made me wonder whether it was wise for me to start producing a podcast this fall. But I do have a podcast called In Good We Trust. But it makes me wonder whether, do we really need one more man talking? Now, in film, men do a lot more talking. This was really what got me started on this talk. In 2016, Hannah Anderson and Matt Daniels published an analysis of 2,000 screenplays of major motion pictures. They found that in 314 of these 2,000, the men and women had roughly the same amount of lines. In 173 of them, women spoke most of the lines, which they defined as between 60% and 100%. And 1,513 of them, the men spoke the majority of the lines, between 60 and 100%. So that's more than 3/4 of the screenplays primarily amplified the voice of men. Now, Forbes journalist Ken Elsesser cited a 2021 study of top-grossing films, and it concluded that only 1/3 of the speaking characters in films are female, and 85% of the films featured more male than female characters. In addition, women are portrayed hemmed in by stereotypes, such as the idea that women are better suited for domestic life than a career. And of the 95 Oscar winners for Best Director, only 3 have been women, the first in 2010. Now, the recent toppling of Harvey Weinstein and the calling out of the silence around his abuse are positive steps, but for many women in Hollywood, they say they're going to carry the scars of sexism their entire lives, including Sarah Polley, who directed the film Women Talking. She wrote a book called Running Towards the Danger, and she describes a sexual assault by radio host Gian Gomishki and how difficult it was to get anyone to take it seriously. Even Polley herself said she was burdened by internal social messaging about women and found it difficult to speak candidly about the abuse. The journalist Rebecca Traister points out that this contributes to a tremendous waste of talent that we don't even realize. She said, quote, "We don't even consider or even see the loss of all the women who, driven out, banished, self-exiled, or marginalized, might have been more talented or brilliant or comforting to us on our airwaves and in our governing bodies, but whom we have never even gotten the chance to know." Now, Polley's internalized self-doubts might be related to the trauma she experienced as a child actor on the set of Terry Gilliam's film, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Now, Gilliam seemed oblivious to Polley's fears and dangers of long hours, dangerous stunts, and explosives on the set. She cites the great artist myth as the excuse for the abuse that seemed to dominate. You know, the need that somehow geniuses have this necessarily dark side of their work, and that dark side might include abuse. You know, think Picasso as an example. Now, one of the reasons that Polley and actress Frances McDormand and other women on the film of Women Talking demanded reasonable hours, breaks on request, and an on-set therapist to help the cast and the crew process the trauma-heavy material. McDormand is well known for progressing inclusive clauses. For example, when she accepted her 2018 Academy Award for Best Actor, her acceptance speech ended with these. She said, "I have 2 words to leave you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Inclusion writer." And that is contractual terms that demand diversity on the set of Hollywood film producers. That may have done more to change Hollywood than almost anything, those 2 words. And that's an example of why words have power. Margaret Atwood, I think, put it best when she said, "A word after a word after a word is power." Women with power are often called on to speak for women silenced by social expectations or fear of reprisal. Audre Lorde wrote extensively about this. She said that she felt like she had to, quote, "write for those women who do not speak, for those who do not have a voice because they are so terrified, because we are taught to respect fear more than ourselves. We have been taught that silence would save us, but it won't." Now, in fact, in the real-life story that inspired the print and film versions of Women Talking, the silence was part of the horror. Women can and must seize power through written and spoken words. Elena Ferrante said in A Power of Our Own, "For centuries men have colonized storytelling. That era is over." Unfortunately, I think we still have work to do. But exploring the power of women's talking, I want to first go to Toews' Mennonite upbringing. It's pronounced Taves from her Low German ancestry. And what happened in this remote area of Bolivia back in 2005. 2,500 people in this remote community. Now, I was intrigued that Taves is a Mennonite herself. I admired the historical pacifism of the Mennonite denomination, but I knew little about other aspects of their culture. And Taves calls herself a secular Mennonite, which many other people call mainline Mennonites. They're indistinguishable in dress and appearance from the general public, and they often use modern conveniences, often shunned by the old order Mennonites. But according to Taves, all Mennonite communities share a preoccupation with sin and evil, as well as strict rules to keep us on the straight and narrow. And she notes that patriarchy and marginalization of women is a big feature of a lot of Mennonite communities. Now, Taves was criticized for writing about sexism in the Mennonite community, but she was criticized the most for women talking. And she said that she thought it was not because she exposed horrible behavior by men, but the fact that she drew attention to the power of women talking. Her novel shows that women can do things when they gather. They can threaten patriarchy. Now, Toews knows a lot about one fundamentalist contingent of her faith because she grew up in Steinbeck, Manitoba, Canada, as a member of the same sect depicted in the book and the film. The founders of the Bolivian colony left Canada, moved to Bolivia, and named their colony Manitoba. Toews noted that the Mennonites have always emigrated to new places in order to better assure self-governance and freedom of religious practice. But unfortunately, along with these otherwise relatively benign religious practices, sexual abuse and violence festered. It's not new to Mennonite communities. In some fundamentalist sects, physical beating is an encouraged tool of child discipline. One immigration official actually told Toews how they facilitate the immigration of Mennonite women into Canada in order to escape the abuse committed by Mennonite men. Sadly, the oppression they suffer within their own communities legally qualifies them to seek refugee status. So, when I decided to talk about this topic, I knew that I'd have to describe horrible violence and abuse by men. It was my intention to focus on the power of women talking more than on the horrible abuse. But it wasn't easy because the more I read, the more I wanted to rant about what went on. But today I'm going to offer a brief description of it, but I do warn you, it's ugly. So beginning in 2005 in this isolated South American area, more than 150 women and some young boys reported waking in the morning in terrible shape. Most were bruised and bleeding with rope burns, torn or missing clothing, and many smeared with semen. They couldn't remember what happened to them. Leaders of the colony explained away the clear signs of sexual assault. Some insisted that the victims were being preyed on by demons. Others of them said that they had been carried away by their, quote, wild female imagination. Now that was a convenient stereotype because it had already been something that they had asserted in their regular day-to-day activities, saying that women were prone to hysterical outbursts. And given a systemic oppressive environment, there was little recourse for the victims, because it was standard practice in this Mennonite community that women were kept illiterate. They were always surveilled. Their movements were restricted. They couldn't leave the colony without permission. And under those conditions, it was difficult for any of them to realize they were being gaslit, psychologically manipulated to believe that they were the problem. Add to this the Mennonite prohibition against discussing many topics about the body or sex. The fact that there was a repeated refrain, actually, in the Mennonite community that certain things about human life, quote, shouldn't be exposed. That was a phrase. Shouldn't be exposed, shouldn't be exposed, shouldn't be exposed. But in 2009, in the 5th year of these assaults, things were exposed. A couple of women discovered the real cause for their torment because they captured 3 men who had been using a veterinarian sedative in gas form to induce unconsciousness in their victims prior to repeated sexual assaults and rape. They used livestock anesthetic. The traumatized women were between the ages of 3 and 65. Some became pregnant, and some victims were raped by relatives. I apologize for how this can land. Despite the Mennonite culture of oppression and control, Bolivian authorities came in and arrested and prosecuted 11 men. 7 were ultimately found guilty. 1 escaped. The veterinarian who supplied the anesthetic gas was given 12 years. The convicted rapists were sentenced to 25 years each. And I think they're all still serving time. But the trauma festered. because the victims were given little opportunity to process their pain and their anguish and their anger. For one thing, in Mennonite communities, anger is usually considered a moral and mortal sin, a failure of character. So people who express anger publicly are shamed, ostracized. So after the trials, a renewed conspiracy of silence descended on the community, making healthy healing nearly impossible. In fact, the women were consistently told that in order to reserve their place in heaven, they had to forgive their attackers. Counseling services did not exist in the community, and when more enlightened Mennonite communities from around the world offered to send counselors to South America, in predictably outrageous fashion, these offers were kept secret. The men who were told of the offers did not inform the women of this potential for healing. Toews even shared that the bishop of the colony said something to the effect of, "Why would they need therapy if they were unconscious due to the drugs during the attacks and they didn't experience them? Why do they need counseling support?" So, these attitudes, along with reports of continued attacks after the trial, led many residents of Manitoba to put bars on their windows and doors. And I wondered what the victims felt like when residents of the community were outwardly, actively asking for the people in jail to be released. Toews' book, Women Talking, came out soon after the trial. So let me shift to the book a little bit. Now, it's intriguing that Toews chose a man to be the narrator for her book. The first thing I thought about when I started that book was how that was jarring. And it wasn't clear to me why she picked August Epp, a somewhat marginalized teacher, to tell the story. I mean, maybe it was that Toews knew that she wanted men to listen and that men often listen more when men are talking. Now, maybe it was that Toews wanted actually to offer Epp as an example to other men on how to step outside of the center of attention and allow other women to speak, because that was very much his personality. Because as the story begins, August says, "My name is August Epp, irrelevant for all purposes, other than I've been appointed to be the minute taker for the women's meeting since women are illiterate and unable to do it themselves." He places his name at the top of the page not because he believes he's an authority. He is a dutiful listener. He begins to speak a couple of times, and then when people ask him what he's saying, he retreats and he says, "Never mind, it wasn't important," revealing a reflective deliberation that many women think all men, myself included, should embrace more often. Epp simply records, refraining from judging or intervening. He's a witness. By the end of the story, it's clear that the minutes that Epp takes aren't even necessary. It's apparent after he's done with them, he gives them to one of the women and say, "You might need these in case you need to start a fire." And he's not saying it, in any rhetorical way. He really meant it. Because it's clear that one of the women that he adores, Ona, asked him to be the scribe to distract him from his depression and suicidal thoughts and to give him a sense of purpose. They didn't need a man to tell their story. Now, the story takes place while the accused are being held by the authorities, and the women gather to decide whether they will stay and fight by pressing charges, or do nothing, or leave the colony and the men behind. Now, if this film had followed a typical Hollywood storyline, it might have included cathartic scenes of righteous revenge, right? I wanted it. But only some of the women, Salome, for example, even talked about revenge. I think Toews minimizes any such sensational option because she, for example, doesn't give any lurid details about the attacks. She does not actually even cover the trial. But I think it's because she wanted to focus on what the title advertised, Women Talking. She does explain why it was unusual, given that women's voices were repressed, stifling customs, denial of public forums, and the trauma that silence is from within. She even offers us a very poignant character named Greta, who is toothless because her husband beat her. So she's an actual and a symbolic silenced victim. Now the women do find private space to have conversations. It's in a second-floor loft of a rarely used barn. Toews said she chose the second-floor loft in order to symbolize a liminal space between the ugly realities on the ground and a heaven in which a God somehow rewarded the faithful and things made more sense. Now, I'll admit, I had some cynicism about sexual abuse in religious communities like the Catholic Church that made it hard for me to understand how these women clung to their faith. It's a faith laced with sexism, but Toews is strong in her Mennonite faith and continues to do what she can to reform it, to make it more just and to bring it into the modern times. She's a Mennonite who accepts anger, though. She knows that anger is necessary to build justice. She didn't seem explosive, because I listened and watched many interviews, but in one interview, her anger was loud and clear, particularly when speaking about how often the abusers escape accountability. Many abusers remain in positions of power, despite efforts of the Me Too movement. But what struck her as most outrageous was the fact that the abusers often serve as ethical arbiters, religious gatekeepers determining who is moral and who's going to hell. This is true in many Mennonite communities, and Toews actually says it's also true in some very Orthodox Jewish sects or some conservative Islamic groups. And Toews channels her anger in her writing, so this believable and complex story unfolds. Now, at the end of the book, the women have the courage to leave the community and its religious abusive practices behind. August is left behind as well, seemingly accepting that in order for the women to start a new life, they need to break completely from the system that so abused them. Now, this intriguing mixture of the women's pragmatism and religious faith is maintained in the 2022 film directed by Sarah Polley. National Public Radio's Dustin Chang emphasizes how somehow, despite the horrible parts of the story, the film, quote, still takes seriously the question of spiritual belief. It's the women's faith in God and ultimately empowers them to imagine a better, fairer way of life, end quote. Now, it may be true for those women, but I want to add that we all know plenty of people without a faith in God who imagine a better life. We all know that too many superficially pious folks also do little to visualize a better world. They hang on to outdated dogma and abusive practices. Now, Polley's film does allow the viewer to stand outside of this patient religious optimism that is a part of the film. But I want to acknowledge that. Toews credits religious faith for contributing to her own liberation. Chang says she concludes the story by saying, concludes his story by saying that despite Toews' religious optimism, he says, you may disagree with her conclusion, and I suspect on some level, Polley wants you to. Women Talking comes to a deeply moving resolution, but it also knows that the conversation is just getting started, end quote. So in this conversation, from my humanist perspective, I don't want to credit God or even faith in God. I want to credit the women for their liberation. I struggle with that aspect. The film differs from the book in only a couple of ways. One is that the book is set in Bolivia and the film is set in Canada. But a second and more important difference between the book and the film is the film version offers a conversation more exclusively led by women. Because when reading the book, I felt that I was in conversation with August Epps, that he was whispering to me as we stood on the outside of the conversation of the book. But as the film went into post-production, they'd already filmed it, they changed the narrator to the voice of Acha, one of the younger women involved. Her words were intended as a message to the unborn child of Ona, her friend. Now this changes the center to women more fully in the film. And it's a minority of Hollywood films that does this, that centers the conversation of women. Also, Ocha's narration offers a lesson about how things can be different for those soon to come into the world. It focuses on a future perspective. It offers the hope that patriarchy will not always dominate and determine the fate of women. So I like that aspect of that. I want to conclude, though, with the most sobering moment I experienced in working on this talk. It involved the epigraph that introduces the story. It's an epigraph that I did not pay enough attention to the first time. I should have. It read, "What follows is an act of female imagination." Now, clearly it's part a barbed reference to how the men of the colony manipulated the women by insisting that the reports of abuse were merely products of their wild female imagination. It also underscores how a novel and a film can be an imaginative, creative act of storytelling, and that verging from the truth can be purposeful and useful. But what wasn't clear to me until after watching the film is what Kate Cohen of the Washington Post called the devastating subtext of women talking. The subtext is that in real life, in the actual Bolivian settlement, the women stayed. They did not leave the colony of Manitoba. They may have been freed from the jailed abusers, at least until they're released. They may have experienced freedom during those conversations about how to imagine an alternative future free of sexism. But unfortunately, the real world was less liberating than its cinematographic portrayal. Which is why Cohen celebrated the imaginative narrative as the escapist film the world really needs. In the literary world, in Hollywood, in way too many fundamentalist communities, and in our lives, patriarchal oppression, embedded in the system and in the minds of women and men, still dominate. The book and the film leave me with a lot of questions that I'm not going to try to answer myself. I need to listen to how women discuss them. I hope some of you can join in that discussion in a women's discussion group that we're going to try to get going here under the leadership of women. Some of those questions include, do the most oppressed in our systems need the escapism offered by this film and book? Do women really need to imagine a better world in order to make it a reality? Is that why Toews wrote the book as she did, with an ending embracing Exodus as salvation? Is that why the female narrator Sarah Polley, created in post-production, tells us that women felt that they, quote, had no invitation anymore to be part of the real? Is that why she added to the film the song by the Monkees titled Daydream Believer? It does reflect the sad reality related by another woman in the film who said, "We are women without a voice. All we have are our dreams. So of course, we're dreamers." So let's keep dreaming for a better world, and let's keep working for it. Thank you.